In this video, we're going to take a look at Diamine Cherry Sunburst. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. This is a very shading red ink that does it really well. Now, I've come to discover I tend to like my reds to be without shading, but this one does it so well. And in some of the darkest areas of shading, it's got a little bit of a brown tone to it, which looks really good. Now, it gives nice colors and tones, but I have also found that they don't look as good on cream-toned paper. They just tend to lose something. They don't do that shading into brown, as nice. And it makes it a little bit of a different red than I'm liking when I'm on plain white paper. So I can say that the tone of the paper, which we know changes how an ink looks, really makes this ink lose some of its something special that it has. All of the tone variations that this ink gives in its writing are really good, just not for me on cream paper. That being said, on white paper, the tone goes from being very good on a fine or a drier pen to great on a broad or very wet pen. And when everything you get looks really good and only gets better, then you know that the ink that you have is truly a winner. And this one is, without a doubt, a winner, even for people who don't use a lot of red or don't use it as a go-to color. I can see this being really good to play with because of how well it performs, and it's awesome on the paper. It's really awesome. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Pilot Custom 912 with a music nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the fine nib, we get some very interesting writing here. Now, we have no feather, no spread. We get a fair amount of shading that really does bring in some interest, like the L and K in flock. The second part of the H in he. There's a lot of back and forth between lighter and darker tones, and it transitions so smoothly and nicely. I like. Now the medium tone, or the medium nib, is a little bit darker than the fine, with no feather, no spread, very nice shading. Look at the word best sellers as it's down there, where it's constantly shifting darker to lighter tones, back and forth. Nothing but personality with this ink. It is really great to look at. The broad has no feather, no spread. It has plenty of good shading that's going on that looks really nice. Even the lighter tones tend to be a little bit darker, and when it gets the darker of the shading, it gets a little bit of a kind of brownish lean to it, which looks good here. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get minor ghosting and no bleeding. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Waterman graduate with a fine nib. A D-like alpha with a medium nib. A Nimicine fission with a broad nib. The next writing sample is done on Leuchtterm 1917 paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread. We get some of that great shading that was going on in the white paper. The thing that's most noticeable to me is the tone change from being on white to cream-colored paper. Now, it's not bad, it's just not a red I want to use a lot of in this case on this paper. The medium is a little bit darker than the fine. It has no feather, no spread. It's still offering quite a bit of shading, even on this paper that has not always been shading very well for us. I think the tone here looks a little bit better when some more of the ink goes down. It's still not my favorite, but I do think it looks a bit better. The broad nib is even darker than the medium with no feather, no spread. It still shades really well. I think the tone is looking better here than it did in the medium. We're still a little bit off in what exactly I would want. However, it is much better and looking pretty good. Looking at the back of the page, we see a normal amount of ghosting and we get no bleed through. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done on Moleskine paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread, really good shading, about as good as we got with the Leuchtterm, which was a bit less than what we got on the Clairfontaine, but that can be expected. There's still this shading. Look at the word wedding, how much it's shifting from lighter to darker to lighter. Very nice. Anniversary, tons of color shift. So good. Not the color for me, but the performance and shading. The medium is darker than the fine with no feather, no spread. I'm not seeing very much shading. It's not shading nearly as well. We do see some spots where it occurs, but the absorbent paper here is winning the battle against shading. So shading is going to need a secret weapon perhaps one day in the future. The broad nib is the same tone as the medium with no feather, no spread. The shading is back here where we had largely lost most all of it in the medium. With the broad, for some reason, it does come back. You can see it in the word at. You see it in the word trial without a problem. In the word dreadful with no issues at all. Looking at the back of the page, we have a normal amount of ghosting and no bleeding. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a composition notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread. The color itself on this paper is much more plain Jane, a red, but it does have some shading. So this is very much red with shading and without some of that extra character that we were seeing, especially on that Clairfontaine. Now, the shading, again, when you look at the word wife, the F is much darker. The D in Dan, in and, the TH in mother-in-law. You get a lot of shading on a paper that normally doesn't give it. The medium is a little bit darker than the fine with no feather, no spread. It still shades really well with this paper doesn't always do, but I think then your notes are going to look pretty darn good. You'll probably get a letter boost just for having such a good looking ink. The broad nib has no feather, no spread. Yes, it still has some shading, so the shade in this ink is strong because it manages to keep that shading even in a lab book, putting things to the test, if you will. See what I did there? It's like an experiment. Looking at the back of the page, we do get some ghosting, nothing too bad, but we get no bleeding at all. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Diamine Crimson. Here is KWZ Cherry. Here is Pelican Garnet. Here is Robert Oster Fire Engine Red. The next writing sample is done in a Mead 5-star notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather. We are getting a tiny bit of spread. There's a couple moments that shading happens, but not really very much. Just a couple darker letters. It's just red here. It's the paper destroying the shading and the characteristic. Medium is darker than the fine. It has no feathering. It has no spread. It has no shading. It's just red, which is good for me. I actually see no problem using this ink on this paper because I like this plain red. Even though I know how much this ink can actually do, I kind of prefer my reds to not have shading. So if I had to use this ink on this paper, I would not be let down. The broad nib does have a tiny bit of feathering. You can see it in the F of father-in-law. You see it in the N of in for in-law, or the N of in for in-law. Did I say in of in? It's the N of in. No real shading going on here and no real spread, so for that it's doing okay. Looking at the back of the page, we're getting fairly normal ghosting for this paper. It does not bleed through where it touches the page underneath. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a shimmering black ink by Diamine, Night Sky. Here's a blue ink by Kaweco, Royal Blue. Here's a turquoise ink by Monteverde, their California Teal. Here is a green ink by Califolio, their Teodora. If you'd prefer different complement colors, then there's links to those different playlists down in the description. Or you can click on my face. That'll take you to my channel page. Then click on the playlist tab. Scrolling down, you'll be able to see all of the playlists that are here on the channel. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feathering, which is very surprising on this paper. We get no spread, which is incredibly surprising on this paper. We get no shading, which is not surprising on this paper. The medium is right about the same tone as the fine. It does have tiny feathers all over it. Look at the entire word Cardano. Cardano is apparently Italian for bird now because he's feathery. Did feathers, everything feathers, he feathers, could feathers. We get it. There's a tiny bit of spread that occurs with the medium, not surprising. No real shading that goes on, not surprising. Looking at the broad nib, we get feathering, not surprising. We get spread, not surprising. We get no shading. Again, not surprising. We do get a plain Jane red, which for this, if you're using a fine nib like that Waterman, then it's a good option to use, and I think it does good things for you. Looking at the back of the page, we get a normal amount of ghosting. I think it did very good looking at how the fine did. Nothing touched the page underneath. Nothing came all the way through. So no real bleeding, just normal ghosting. Ooh. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? This ink does always look good. So for that, I'll say it's a dealer's choice. You can have the confidence to put this in any pen and get a very good experience with it. Now, for me, I really like the darker tones that we get, and the darker tones can come with shading as long as you're not using an absorbent paper. So I really like how this looked from the music nib. I would suggest, since not everybody has a music nib, going with a wet stub or a wet broad. I believe that you get your nicest tone, your nicest shading out of this without a doubt. It is so nice. Thanks for watching.